Welcome to number 27 in this Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. So we're talking about Andre Norton, who wrote an ungodly amount of books at one time or another. You can see it in the timeline. I only put some of the books that she wrote in the timeline, but you'll see just how many there are in there. So welcome to those who are new. And what we usually do in this is we look at a little bit of biography and the nature of the world that she creates. There's a very clear, coherent narrative world running through the witch world. And then I usually have some philosophical themes picked out, and we usually end up veering off into others as well. We have people here who've read the book and some who haven't, so this is really good. So the themes that I thought we would talk about are rule and wisdom and the relationship between those in these books. And then her models that she sets out for relations between men and women, and there's a number of different models running through these. The relationship between what she conceives of as magic and then technology, how these blend together in this world, and then how people who don't actually have access to this wind up making use of them in one way or another. And then identity. We often say like coming of age, and there's a lot of coming of age themes in her stories, but I think it goes beyond the typical young adult coming of age sort of thing, where it's more about determining or discovering one's identity. So those are some interesting themes. We can certainly talk about others. I gave a map and then a timeline, the map might be helpful when we're talking about some of the events in the book. But before we do that,
do you have any more?
Yeah, here. You have all three.
Yeah, it's all there.
Yeah.
Yep. So,
Yeah.
yeah. No, you want the whole
That's
thing.
the whole thing.
The whole thing.
You want the timeline and the
whole
map.
thing.
Yeah. So, Norton is born in 1912. She dies in her 90s. And she was pretty productive through most of her life. You notice that she actually changes her name, in part because she felt that would help her in publishing. She was writing at that time what we would now call, young adult, or actually juvenile too, novels, and mostly for boys, adventure stuff. So she changes her name to Andre Alice Norton. I guess I always knew that she was a woman. The first book of hers that I encountered was in my Uncle Hubert's library. The Jargoon Part was way in the middle of her series. I thought it was pretty cool, and it was already listing her as a woman, so I just thought Andre was a girl's name, actually, from where she came from. I didn't know much about her biography at that time, but she was born in Cleveland and spent a good bit of time there. You notice once she graduates from high school, she enrolls at Western Reserve, which is now Case Western Reserve. She wanted to be a history teacher, and she stressed the importance of studying history throughout her life, especially when she would talk with other fiction writers. She gave a lot of advice over the years. But she had to drop out of college, in part because it was the Depression. So she winds up working in the Cleveland Library. She actually worked in almost every single branch of the Cleveland Library. She got transferred around here and there. And then she started writing. And her first book is not a science fiction or fantasy book. It's an adventure book, The Prince Commands. She doesn't actually start writing anything recognizable as her preferred genres until Huon of the Horn in 1951. But in that time, she does a lot of interesting stuff. She becomes a special librarian in the cataloging department of the Library of Congress, so she goes down to Washington, D.C., and takes up residence there. While she's there, she actually buys a bookstore in Maryland and tries to make a go of it, but it never really takes off and unfortunately goes out of business after a while. And then she goes back to Cleveland. Her first science fiction story is published in this anthology just called Fantasy Book. And that's 1947. So you notice there's a good bit of writing over a decade where she's not writing in the genres that she's going to be known for later on. She'll retire from the Cleveland Library due to some health issues, and then she begins working as a reader for Gnome Press. So this is kind of a cool job if you're going to be writing stuff, right? Because you're looking at other people's manuscripts and making contacts within the industry. And notice she just starts churning stuff out after that. Some years she published 4 or 5 books. And some of these are the Witch World ones. The ones that fit into that are the ones in bold. So you can see that there's kind of a progression going on, but she's got a lot of other series that she's writing. She becomes a full-time writer in 1958 after she's already published a number of books. She decides, okay, this is what I'm going to do full-time. She doesn't get a lot of awards during her lifetime, unfortunately, given how much impact she had. She's nominated for a Hugo but doesn't win the Hugo. And she's actually one of the founding members of the Saga Guild. And I put 1965 there. Nobody actually can give you a good date on when Saga formed. It's very difficult to find out. But then there's a few other kind of trivial things that are interesting. Dungeons and Dragons. Some of us probably played that at one time or another. Gary Gygax, the guy who created it, here in Wisconsin, he invited her to play in his Greyhawk campaign. So he was using her he was very interested in having a big author come in. By now she's very established. So it's kind of an honor for her, but it's kind of an honor for him. She writes the very first of the Dungeons and Dragons themed fantasy novels. And then others, follow in her wake. She starts getting, some more formal recognition, getting a Grand Master Award from the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. Moves around from time to time. Eventually settles in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And while she's there, she helps found this High Halleck Library. High Halleck is one of her lands. And she founds this library, which is actually in her garage. And it's a research library for fantasy and science fiction writers. So as opposed to other, university research libraries, which are for more academic purposes, this is a library for people who want to practice the craft. And this is also why she starts collaborating with so many other authors. If I didn't put the collaborators on here because I wouldn't be able to fit them all in the timeline.
Well, just off the top of my head, Mercedes Lackey, Diana Paxton.
Yeah.
Who else?
There's more than 20 people.
There's like 20. Yeah, there's like 20 other authors she coordinated. She worked with.
Yeah. Now, do you know why she was so keen to do that?
Well, she was
getting older.
She was getting older, but she was mentoring people. She was crazy about mentoring.
Well, there was that too.
Female writers. Because they were all female writers.
Part of it, though, was she realized that she needed to raise money for this High Halleck Library. And so she thought, well, if I collaborate with people, I can churn out more books and make more royalties, and I can put that into the library. So, it's all kind of fitting together, right? The mentoring, the promoting other people's literature and scholarship. And that went on for quite a while. She eventually dies in 2005, and she was still working hard to change things in the industry even then. By that time, young adult novels were really becoming big, and she was upset about the fact that within the science fiction world, most of the awards were for adult things. So she wanted to see some sort of award for young adult novels, and she pushed the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America to do that. And then she found out about that as she was on her way into the hospital for her last and fatal illness, that they'd actually approved the award and had created it. So she lived quite an interesting life, very devoted to the craft, constantly stressing the need to not just read other science fiction, but to read literature, to read history, to incorporate these elements into one's work. And she leaves behind a massive legacy of books. She's probably, they call her the grand dame of science fiction. And I guess that kind of makes sense, right? So let's talk about this actual world then. What is the witch world? So you notice it starts in 1963, and if you've ever seen the copy that I had, I didn't unfortunately bring it because I had to return it to the library. The artwork is not quite so nice as these newer ones. It's actually kind of strangely off-putting to see the cover art, but that went along with it, and it includes these sort of maps, and everything in the first one really takes place just in this part of the map, between Estcarp, Alazan, Gorm, and Karsten, and it's a world in which you've got all these different peoples, much of which we don't learn about at the start. She only reveals bits and pieces to us as she needs to. So in the first two novels, we're really just confined to this part of the map, and she's slowly revealing the back histories of these peoples and places. And then in the third and then subsequent ones, the ones that are in this sort of omnibus volume, the Lost Lands, that has 3 Against the Witch World, Warlock of the Witch World, and Sorceress of the Witch World, which are about the children. I'll talk about them in a moment. We find out about the other parts of the continent, and she keeps on getting bigger and bigger and bigger in scope. So I don't know if she actually, you might know this, you might know whether she planned that out at any point in time, or whether she just sort of added to it over time.
I never saw anything indicating that she planned it.
So she's not an architect in that
She's a gardener.
sense.
She's a gardener.
Now, the witch world itself is very old. And there are these people there called the Old Race. And there are some of the original inhabitants of the land. And then there's all these other people who've come in at one point or another. And I guess you could say what's unique to it is that there are these gates that allow you to move from some other world into the witch world. And the story begins with this guy Simon Tregarth going through one of these gates. He's been in World War II. He was an army officer. He's there in Germany after the war, and he somehow gets involved in the black market and essentially kicked out, and he's running from the authorities, and he knows about this guy who can disappear you. And the way that the guy can actually disappear you is by sending you to a different world. So he gets sent to the witch world, and he winds up there with his pistol and a few other things, and immediately finds himself in this territory of Alazan, and there's a woman who's being pursued by hounds and these horsemen who are trying to track her down. He intervenes. As it turns out, he doesn't even really need to, because she's a witch, and she calls lightning down to kill the pursuers, and they sort of take up together. And then the story really centers on this place, Estcarp, where the old race lives, and they're sort of on their last legs. That's the way they're portrayed through much of these early stories. They have women in charge who are witches. They run the society, and everybody else in the world is lined up against them. And so Alazan is pressing on them from the north. Karsten is pushing on them from the south. They have a few allies here and there, but there's also this place, Gorm. And Gorm is an island who brought in an ally who then took advantage of them and essentially colonized them. And that is the Kolder. The Kolder are a group of humans who have a high level of technology, so much so that they can dominate the minds of other people. and they take the people from Gorm and essentially turn them into zombies, willing to fight for them. So you're placed in the middle of the story, right? Sort of in media res, as they say. And most of the first and the second book is the story about how the people of Estkarp, including some of the main characters, are able to fight off these different invaders and win themselves a breathing space. In the process, Simon winds up falling in love with this witch who won't even reveal her name to him until the end of the book, because names are power. Jalith, I guess, is how it's pronounced. And they eventually do get married and have 3 kids.
Does he know that she's a witch?
Oh, yeah. At the very beginning, she calls lightning down and kills off these dogs and horsemen. So yeah, he knows it, and he knows that she's part of the sort of ruling class there, and he and other people are involved in trying to fight off these various enemies. So the first 2 books are about that, and then we get the story of their kids in the next 3 books. And they end up leaving Estkarp and going across these mountains. So that's kind of the backstory, and what else should we say about it? It's essentially at a medieval level of technology, right? So it's fantasy. There is magic going on, right?
Well, as you read through the stories, you find out the old race is really not them. The old race was the original race on this planet.
Yeah.
And the witches actually came through a gate.
Oh, okay. What
all
book
of
is
the
that
civilizations that are there came through a gate.
Yeah.
At some point in their history.
Yeah. And some are still coming through.
And some are still coming through. And they realize in their ancient history they came through from someplace else. They're not original to this world.
Yeah, so that would I was struggling to think about usually I try to have 5 philosophical themes, right? And I only really came up with 4 that I could sink my teeth into. But that notion of we're not really the first is kind of a cool idea. And Norton was very interested in not just history but also ethnography. So she was reading ethnographic studies of Native American tribes or Polynesian peoples, and she's incorporating some of this ideas into that. And if you think about how in history we've portrayed original inhabitants, we call it indigenous peoples, right? It often turns out to be wrong. You think about Europeans, right, and European identity right now. The people that we know as the Indo-Europeans weren't the first people in Europe. The Basques are about all that's left of that original group of people who were, pushed out, absorbed, colonized, and then, then everyone can forget and say, we've always been here. The Sioux, I remember reading this classic ethnographic study about the Sioux. They started out essentially in the woodland area, not that far from here, got pushed out onto the plains by other tribes who were more successful in warfare against them, and within about 20 generations forgot entirely that they had ever lived anywhere else, and developed all sorts of origin stories about how they'd always lived on the plains, always hunted the buffaloes, when it was really an adaptive behavior. So I guess you could say that Norton is playing around with that idea, and what always happens when you bring this up, it really ticks people off, right? If you tell people, well, you're not as original as you think, people don't like to hear that. So it leads to similar conflicts in her stories, right?
Well, and they find out when you get into the High Halleck novels, you find out the old ones had magic.
Yeah.
A different kind of magic. But they had magic. And you see it with the Kelpiads. There's a creature called the Kelpiad.
That I don't remember.
Yeah, that's in the High Halleck novels.
Yeah.
You come across them in the High Halleck novels. And they're original to this world. But they're a different kind of creature.
Yeah.
So you get into some different things when you start getting into the Dales and High Halleck. And you run across, there are still ruins from the old ones.
Yeah.
There are still places, sacred places.
We should probably say something. So the High Halleck stuff is happening on a different continent than all of this stuff here. But it's still the same world. And so, you know, I mean, how many books in would that be into the series where those I mean, so she's slowly unpacking the world bit by bit by bit.
1995.
Yeah.
Key of the Kelpian came out in 1995.
Yeah.
Well, Jargoon Pard, I think was.
That's 74.
I think that was in High
That's
Halleck.
High Halleck, yeah.
That's High Halleck.
That was the very first one I read.
Well, actually, in the three, in the original Witch World trilogy,
Yeah.
the third one is in High Halleck.
No, it's in Escor. It's across the mountains.
Okay, I thought it was in High Halleck. Three against, let's see, Year of the Unicorn, I'm sorry.
The Year of the Unicorn.
Year of the
So
Unicorn.
in the same year, she's actually like starting divergent
Yeah, Year of the
storylines.
Unicorn is in Dales,
Yeah, yeah,
which is in High Halleck.
yeah. So
She started that early.
So I mean, do we want to explore that theme any further? This like you're not really the originals, or should we move on to another aspect of the world that she's creating, like the men and women thing?
Was it harder for people to take in the concept of not being the originals or not being the original culture?
What would be the distinction there?
Well, I'm thinking in terms of belief systems.
Yeah.
Religions, belief systems. People debate what was the first, you know.
In terms of,
Well,
you mean in terms of religions?
Yeah, in terms of religions, we were the first with this, or we were the, you know, we're the
Yeah.
original. You hear it with, you know, across
Even
different
with
religions.
Yeah, even with reform movements, they're always we're going to get back to the beginning.
The beginning,
this.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's quite true. I mean, but the distinction that you were making between being the original culture and then being the original inhabitants.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, you could be the original inhabitants, but take on somebody else's culture, is what you're saying, right?
Possibly, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, I think in terms of,
I mean, that does happen with most of the indigenous peoples, right?
if you told most people who are Christian, Jewish, or Islamic,
Yeah.
that they're not the first
Monotheistic. Yeah.
civilization,
Yeah.
they would not be happy. But they're not.
Yeah.
There
Well, and
was
they're-
a monotheistic civilization.
Zoroastrianism.
Zoroastrianism.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the notion of
Which
hell
is
being
much
a
older.
fiery place, a lot of the angelology. I mean, it comes into Judaism precisely because the
But if you-
Persians were the ones who brought them out of the Babylonian captivity.
But there's a lot of theologians who write that Judaism is the first monotheistic religion.
Oh yeah, yeah,
And it's not.
yeah. I think.
If you raise
and-
that with certain people who,
and the
that's their
issue-
culture.
Yeah, the issue often is that when you bring it up, it'll provoke such anger.
Well, because they want to be the one with the truth.
Yeah.
And
Or it's
you
Or
know,
challenging your
they thought they
authenticity.
were.
And here's
Well-
the interesting thing. I mean, I think for a lot of people, originality and truth wind up being fused together. And it could be that maybe we don't want the original thing. Maybe we want the more developed final thing rather than the original
It was about
thing,
10, 15 years ago, they discovered another little hominid. Where the heck was that?
New Guinea, wasn't it?
In New Guinea, yeah.
Some little guy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and it was a
Genetically very
completely
different,
different hominid, you know.
Are you thinking of what is it? Starts out with a D-E-N-I.
Yeah,
Denisovan
But whatever
man,
the thing,
yeah.
whatever all of this, it just threw a lot of the religious world into a tiz.
Oh,
Because, you know,
yeah.
they had the old Adam's
Garden of
theory.
Eden. Yeah.
Is it human, subhuman?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so they thought they had it all figured out, but when something puts a kink in there, they get really, really very upset and all, because then their idea of what is truth is now been, has been challenged. And for some people with very narrow thinking, that's very hard to do.
Yeah, and so we see that reflected here in for example, with the witches, right? So the witches themselves are a very conservative institution in this society of Estkarp. They're unable to sort of listen to anybody who's got something new to propose. So Simon and I always get her name. Yeah, Jalith. So they get married, right? And the witches are actually supposed to lose their power when they lose their virginity. So she doesn't lose her power, and he also has some magical power, which men aren't supposed to have at all. Their kids wind up with power as well. They have 2 boys and 1 girl. The witches try to take the girl and sort of force her into this training, I guess you would call it, or discipline of being a witch of their sort. And it's not a very good fit, we could say. Right? She actually ends up becoming something different by the end of her storyline. She becomes she's using a different kind of magic. She becomes a sorceress. But they have a very rigid conception of things, and so do many of the other people. So we should talk about gender. The witches themselves, it's a matriarchal society. They do magic. Men don't do magic. They run the show. Not all women actually have the gift, just the certain ones. And then they're trained in it. And it's a trade-off. They can't reproduce unless they give up their power. And they do need to reproduce in order to have more with power. So there's a bit of a question about how you actually do that. There's another culture that's almost diametrically opposed to them, these falconers, who are allies to Estkarp and the witches in a certain respect. These are all guys who have these...
Eerie's.
Yeah, and what would you say about the relation to the falcons? It's not telepathic as such, but they're very attached to their birds.
It is very, yes, well, I'd say telepathic.
You think?
Yeah, they communicate with their birds mentally.
Over a distance, though?
Over distances,
Okay.
yeah.
So
They're linked.
Yeah, and the birds do incredible things. These guys, it's a complete brotherhood. No women at all involved. They have villages of women that they go to just for the purpose of having sex and making kids. And then they take the male kids and leave the females behind. And we don't really know much about the females.
It's like the opposite of Amazons.
Oh yeah, you're right.
It's
Okay,
the
yeah,
exact opposite of the Amazon culture.
Yeah, the Amazons would take mates, and they would only take the female children and then induct them into their society. So you have 2 similar societies in a way. One matriarchal, one completely patriarchal. They distrust each other, but they're both older, so they're willing to fight against the other younger cultures who threaten to sort of swamp them. Karsten to the south, what we see being depicted there, it's a very male-dominated society, but it's much more in terms of women being concubines or being used as chips in bargaining for marriage. One of the characters who we get in there, one of the really well-developed, at least in the first book, characters is Lois. This woman who may, in fact, some people theorize that she was, going to a different author, George R. Martin, that Brienne of Tarth may be modeled after Lois. Yeah, I think that's plausible. So Lois is an unattractive, tall, thin, very manly woman who happens to be, unfortunately, a local princess. Well, not quite princess, right?
She's a highborn.
Yeah, I forget exactly what it's not a duchy. It's something a little bit smaller than that, right?
But marrying her gives them control of a piece of land.
Exactly. Yeah. So she's being used by her stepfather to try to solidify an alliance, and she really, she's not into that. She likes doing, stuff with fighting and sailing and all that. And she's been sort of pushed into this, you need to act like a lady thing. And she ends up deciding to run away. And what she does is she dresses like a man-at-arms. And at that time, there's actually a witch, Jalith, who's prisoner there. And so she frees her and takes her, and she becomes part of you could say, the unit fighting for Estkarp. And then she meets, she's still traveling incognito as a guy, and she meets, now what was his name? Oh, Chorus. Chorus is one of the, interestingly, another thing one critic pointed out, Chorus is one of the first really well depicted dwarf characters. I mean, we have Gimli, and people like that in Tolkien stuff, but he's got a giant head and sort of deformed body, but he's a very tough guy. Fights with an axe and is able to command men. He's from Gorm. He had to leave his ancestral home before it was taken over, and he fights as well. And along the way, these two fight together, and come to appreciate each other, let's say, and then fall in love with each other. Shortly after she reveals that she's a woman, right? There's no.
He figures it out.
Yeah. But so what you see here is Norton is very willing to play with male and female roles in ways that many people writing in her time were not willing to do. She doesn't like to depict sex. As a matter of fact, that was one of the things one of her collaborators brought up, that this person almost didn't get to collaborate because some of the books they'd written had too many juicy scenes in them. So Norton had to be, assured that there wouldn't be any, gratuitous sex scenes in there. But she's very good at depicting love relationships developing over time. She's very, interested and conscious about this. And it is one of the things that I found. So she almost reverses gender roles at times too. Simon, the main character, the guy who comes in from outside, he is the one who kind of mopes around and is, quite emotional and sometimes actually gets a little weepy from time to time in the first two books about the relationship. And Jalith is much more practical. She gets things done, It's not that they don't love each other, but she's, in some respects, she's got a better, it's not that she's unemotional either. She's got a better handle on her emotions than he does. What's that?
Organized.
Well, she was almost second in command.
You mean from the witches? Yeah,
From the witches. So she was in a position of
authority.
Power and authority.
Yeah, but he was too.
Long before she met him.
But he was too. I mean, he was an army officer. He
but
commanded
he wasn't
troops.
at the top of the top of the stack.
Well, but
she's sitting right at the top.
There
of the
we can
stack.
talk about scale, though, right? Because, I mean, think about the U.S. military forces in Europe. I mean, you had over 1 million people, right? So I don't think Escarp even has remotely close to that population. Mm-hmm. I mean, if he was a captain, he would have commanded at least 120 men. I forget. I think he was a captain, right?
I think so. Yeah.
So
he was an officer.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking she was right next to the top, the woman, the witch who was leading the country.
Yeah.
And so she was used to making those kinds of decisions and being around those kinds of decisions and leading the army, working with Chorus to lead the army. So she was used to that kind of authority.
Making alliances too.
Doing spying, because she's in Carson because she was spying.
True. Yeah.
Sometimes with characters that have those kinds of strengths, the well-matched capabilities allow either character to step outside of his or her prescribed or proscribed gender roles because they aren't sacrificing anything in the relationship, right? If both are competent and have military minds and have efficiency, he doesn't have to be operating at that level all the time. And I think that sometimes you see...
Oh, yeah, so he doesn't have to be the sole...
Because she's got... It's a well-matched match. I mean, not to go back to...
Yeah, Chorus and Luis are like that too, yeah.
That's why everyone's so excited about the prospect of, Jon Snow and Daenerys, right? I mean, even...
or Brienne of Tarth and... what's his name?
Jaime
Lannister.
Well, no, I was thinking about...
the other guy with the wildling?
Yeah, the guy with the big beard and stuff.
Yeah.
Thormund
I
or?
can't remember.
Thormund,
Yeah.
Thormund.
But people get very excited about powerful couples because
Oh, yeah,
the
interesting.
vulnerabilities and the strengths are both multiplied. And
it's
so both
imbalanced.
can be more fluid with that,
Mhm.
right? Because there's not this sense that if one goes more toward an emotional bend or more toward
Yeah.
the opposite, that somehow there's a deficit in the relationship. There wouldn't be one.
I think that works here. You know, and the other thing is we do have a triad too, right, with the two brothers and one sister as well.
The triplets.
Yeah, and they're sort of stuck at birth because Jalith decides. I actually wrote this down? Yeah, she sets sort of a vocation on them: warrior, sage, witch. It says 3, 1, I will this, each a gift, together one and great, apart far less. So they're supposed to have that kind of reciprocity working together as well. And they don't do as well when they're apart from each other, when they're separated. They actually have that is almost like a telepathic bond, right? With between the three of them, where they're able to call to each other. So yeah, let's talk about rule then. Jalith is part of the ruling class until she loses her power, and then she's kind of on the outs with the witches. The witches are willing to give men some power, sort of delegating it to them to fight, to lead troops, but they mostly keep power to themselves, and they have a lot of power, not just in terms of political power, but in terms of magic. They actually at one point raised these mountains up to destroy an invading army and to cut off Karsten from them and sort of settle that issue one time for all. So that's a lot of power. Now, what we can ask the question, not just who has power, but who should have power, who should rule, and this is a question of political philosophy. What is the basis for getting to be in charge? This is something that we work through every generation. Who's supposed to benefit from it? Some of the characters in this clearly are out for power, but they're not saying, well, I should be in charge because it's going to be better for everybody if I'm in charge. It's more like, well, I deserve power, or I can take the power, so therefore you better listen to me. We do have some other characters who are not like that. Simon, for example, or Chorus. But most of them seem to be, competing for power. So what are the sort of claims that somebody could or should make to justify being given authority?
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
So Jalith is she the only witch that doesn't lose power
Well,
after coupling, or no?
they believe he will lose power.
And so they do, because
So they do,
I
because
see.
they believe it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sort of like the
She
placebo effect.
discovers,
Right.
she thinks she's lost her power.
Yeah.
And she discovers after they've been married just a very short time that she does still have power.
And she has all of her power?
It's taken a different twist,
Yeah.
Okay.
slightly different, but
But
she
not
still has
diminished?
power, but it's not particularly diminished.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have the witches have a gem that they use sort of to
To focus
focus.
their power.
But it turns out that you don't actually need it. And it's
I mean,
because
that's an interesting.
yeah, it's because she's with Simon. So most the men in that world don't have the power, right? They don't have the magical ability, but Simon does. It turns out, and this has actually been useful for him in the Earth world, where he could sort of predict where enemy troops were going to go, but never really understood why. And so, in a way, he's sort of like the catalyst for her rediscovering that she's not just an ordinary housewife now. She's actually still a viable witch.
Would Andre Norton have been particularly influenced by the feminist movement? I mean, is there a lot written about that?
She has a lot of strong female characters in
Yeah.
all of her books.
But to have a male who isn't supposed to have power, and to have a woman who doesn't lose power after coupling and transforms rather than diminishes, is sort of an interesting commentary on like the
Well, and they find
essentialist
out-
argument
That's a
about
hell of a
feminism,
loaded-
right?
Yeah.
Well, and you find out that you put the two of them together, they have a different power by the two of them working together
As
Yeah.
partners.
as partners. They
So,
can-
I mean,
they can combine their two powers and have something else different.
Yes, I mean, it's not
That's an
like,
interesting comment on both power and gender, in a,
Yeah.
you know, in a way, because it's,
I mean, is she influenced in, we can talk about different kinds of feminism, right? So there's like we got to equalize everything, sort of like Mary Wollstonecraft, you know. Everyone should be brought up to the same level, sort of feminism.
yeah, I was
And
thinking strictly of the sort of arguments for and against essentialism. That would have been,
Okay.
you know,
Well, I mean, this is coming out in '63,
yeah.
so I mean, it's tough to say because she's very literate, right? So she's you know, not only a librarian, but she's selling books. She's reviewing things. Presumably, she would have been pretty well tapped in, you know.
Yeah, and the mentoring of,
And when she was one of the
Women.
first female science fiction writers.
Yeah,
it was just a, you
Yeah.
know, it was kind of a
certainly the most
curiosity at this
prolific.
point.
I think you could say.
One of the most, you know. Lackey probably can match her
Really?
today, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
That is
Mercedes
quite an
Lackey,
output.
Mercedes Lackey can probably match her today,
Okay.
if you look at her list.
Yeah.
When you talk about power in this land, what I saw, and I see it in other books too, you see it in the Darkover series and some
Yeah.
others. A lot of medieval power structures. In Karsten, it's a very medieval power structure.
Yeah.
With the men owning the land, the men being in power, they're the royalty.
Yeah.
And you see that in the Dales over in High Halleck
Yeah.
a lot. Because the people who settle the Dales come from the mainland across, they're refugees.
Yeah. And women are essentially reduced to sort of like.
Women are wives and they take care of the house. And,
Yeah. Well, but they're also used as sort of
They're
like
also-
bargaining between men.
yeah, for,
Cementing alliances.
yeah, cementing alliances, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Escarp, the women are the power is within the women because they have power.
Yeah.
Because they have magical power. If they didn't have magical power,
They'd be like everybody
they'd
else.
be like everybody else.
Yeah.
In Alazan, the power structure is based on warriors.
Yeah, it's, in some ways it's more
They're very
barbaric, right?
They're very war oriented, very barbaric oriented. In Gorm, I don't know that they're really human, but theirs is technology.
Oh,
They think
well,
they're better than everybody
Yeah, yeah.
because of their technology.
You mean the colder people?
The colder, I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah,
the colder,
yeah.
the colder.
We should actually talk about that a little bit because we've mentioned them a few times. So this group comes in from another gate, and these are they call themselves the Colder, and they start taking over parts of the world. So they get brought in as allies by Gorm, this island, and then they just take over the whole place. And they have much greater technology. They have planes that can bomb places. They have great weapons, and then they take the dead or captives and turn them to their purposes, and it's through kind of primitive technology. Well, I mean that's sort of I almost imagine like a colander being on somebody's head the way it was described with some wires coming out of it. But they have these things that are placed on people's heads. And they tap into their brains, and then they can control them. And they're like zombies. This is like way before zombie literature and shows and stuff like that. But the way that they're described is very similar to what we see on the shows that people are watching today. And so they're trying to figure out, how do you stop these people? How can you break the control that they have? Because they're relentless. They take over the culture in Karsten, and the only people that can't be controlled by them are these people of the old race. Everybody else can. So that's part of why Colder is trying to wipe out Escarp. We find out later on that there's still an open gate. Go ahead.
Oh no, I'm sorry.
Oh.
We were just.
Yeah, and there's some people left on the other side, and then they're actually used to eventually destroy the Colder, but it takes a long war against them, and you could say that in a way the Colder is almost like an element of horror isn't it? Would you say, rather than just straight fantasy or science fiction, it's kind of like a
Body horror, maybe?
yeah. I mean, like the notion of these people can take you over and turn you into a mindless drone who's going to serve their evil purposes. You know,
Is this the whole world?
No,
it's
there's
part
more.
of it.
Oh, there's more?
No,
Yeah.
there's
So,
more.
to the east of Escarp,
Is Escort.
Escor, what is that dark tower connected to? That's the only thing I can read on the far right.
Oh,
Looks
dark
like it says
tower.
underwater something.
Yeah,
But it
it's,
can't
it's
be
a little,
because
it's
those
a
are
little hard to
mountains.
make out. So there's a whole bunch of place names in Escort. Those are the things that are happening in these
So that the
books.
children are in Escort.
Yeah, and so actually that's worth talking about as well. So, you know, in the stories, they keep talking about north, south, and west. And nobody ever talks about the east. And you might, why the hell not? It'd be like sort of like living, let's say you lived in Waukesha, and you knew that, you know, Brookfield existed, and, you know, Wales and Delafield. What's to the north of Waukesha?
Menominee
Yeah.
Falls.
There you go, Falls, and then to the south would be what, like Mukwonago? Now imagine you never thought about Mukwonago. You'd never go south.
Yeah.
Why the hell not, right? Well, because as it turns out, the witches in Escarp, that whole civilization, they came out of the east, and they sort of established, what would you call it? Sort of a mental block, right? Preventing anybody from thinking about it.
Was it more? So it was more of an exodus than like a diaspora. Like they chose to leave.
Yeah. it
That's
was
an interesting
more-
distinction.
Yeah, it was more of an exodus, I think.
Yeah. In an exodus, you're fleeing. You don't know exactly where you're going, but you're just trying to get the hell out of there, and you might be fleeing persecution or something like
Well,
that.
Escort has a lot of old race
Yeah,
location sites like Green Valley,
yeah,
where you have remnants of the old race. You have sacred sites, you have magical sites.
you have people who are at one time connected with the old race, but the old race in Escarp has lost all memory of that.
And you're saying that's sort of a selective amnesia.
Yeah, and the kids, this is part of the plot points in the third novel. The one who's the sage, the middle brother, he figures out that there's something to the east, and that nobody else seems to be able to understand it. He does this through like reading texts, and then he proposes, let's get out of Escarp, and we're going to go east, because there's really nowhere else to go. So he says, we'll go east, and then they'll never find us. Now, how are they able to break that block? Well, their father is, he's from Earth. So they don't participate in that mental block in the same way that everybody else does.
So he's a sage. There's another brother
Who's a warrior.
who's a warrior, and then the sister becomes the sorcerer.
She's a
Yeah,
sorceress.
she's supposed to be a witch, but,
Okay, but she
comes.
decides to.
Yeah, and that's a good place to talk about another theme. So magic, you know, we've been bringing this up. There's different kinds of magic in this world. A lot of it, you know, people who've talked about, you know, models for magic say that much of the magic in Lost Lands of the Witch World, or in the Witch World stuff, is what you call low magic, where it's almost like a technology, right? You got to know how to manipulate things. Yeah. You have to use the right rules to get things done, rather than just having power that you just like snap your fingers and a fireball comes out. You actually have to like do things the right way to make the fireball happen. So it is kind of like a technology that's using forces that others can't perceive, and there's multiple ways to do this in this world.
Does the sorcerer's daughter have? She would have the ability to be a witch with the gem and everything, but instead she chooses sorcery.
She has a different kind of power.
Okay.
Because her father is Simon and her mother
Yeah.
is Jaleth. She has an entirely different kind of power.
Does it require that she like study to be a sorceress
Well,
and
they-
cast spells and all that kind of
Yeah,
stuff?
and she does do that eventually. But the witches also try to sort of force her into their model of doing things as well.
And she rejects that, or she's
Well, she's stuck with it until her brothers get her out of there,
Okay.
and the only reason why they're able to actually do that is because the witches do that mountain raising thing, and that requires so much attention and power that it weakens their capacity.
perception and-
Yeah,
The
and
capacity
yeah.
they lose power.
so they these are three, like, essentially like, teenagers, and they all go east.
But in terms of the question of magic, like the changes in their power structure are more a consequence of their birth than they are any sort of like evolution in the way that this society is being.
Say that one more time. The changes in whose power
In
structure?
the triplets.
Oh,
Or not
the
triplets.
changes in their
They're
status?
just three,
you
they're
mean?
three, they're not triplets, they're three.
They are
They're
triplets.
They're triplets, okay.
Yeah.
They're
So
triplets.
the triplets, the fact that, he's a sage and the other's a warrior and she's a sorceress, or
Yeah.
becomes a sorceress, the reasons that those paths are available to them, or those become the paths they take, is because their situation is a consequence of their birth, because they were born to
Yes.
a father from Earth and a witch.
Well, and the father
Right.
from Earth is himself a warrior,
With some power,
right?
okay.
So he commands troops in Escarp.
Is there, in her writings, is there a lot about what they then would have as children and
Yeah.
the powers that they would have?
Yeah.
So is there a theme of like shifting powers and shifting magic from generation to generation then? Where they're like, like the next generation is surprised by some new ability, whereas, like, is it a constantly transforming thing?
Yeah, I'd say so probably, because you see it in the High Halleck stories,
Yeah.
where children are born out of a relationship where someone from the old blood marries a human,
Yeah.
or breeds with a human. And then the children have different powers, maybe even physical, physically they're different. Like there's one character who's a prince who has hooves like a goat.
So it's kind of a cool mythology. That's why I'm asking
Yeah,
the
I
question.
think you can also say too that in each like generation of the story, because you can talk about like different. The first two novels are one generation. The next three are another generation. They're not only like figuring out where they fit in, they're also encountering so much new stuff.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things that Norton is particularly good at is, and this isn't really a theme, but it's something worth pointing out. How do you take a world that you've already created and bring something new into it, like a new culture, new rules for things to go, and not screw up the general picture at the same time? I think a lot of authors aren't able to pull that off very well. We see this in television shows all the time, right?
Right.
Where we start out with like one early conflict, like the Earthmen versus these people, right? And then we find out that there's a larger world, and it's very tough to keep expanding it in such a way that you don't ruin the story in the process. And it may be the fact that there's a good bit of time between these, sometimes a year, sometimes several years. It gives her time to. Although she's writing so much other stuff, maybe she doesn't have that much time to plan it out. I don't know. The other thing that I'll say too, stylistically, and those of you who've read it, tell me if I'm dead wrong on this. The books kind of feel like they're not unfinished in the sense of like not polished writing. They definitely are well written. But each one in like the first 5 books ends in such a way that you're like, what? It ends here? It's not. You don't have a complete resolution with any of them, and they go very quick when you're reading them, too.
Yeah, it's like they're written to be a series.
They're almost. I was thinking about this as I was coming in. They're almost like they were written for pulp stuff, but she didn't write for pulp. Right? Some of the authors that we looked at, they would write, these stories, and they'd have to be serialized. This is more like each one of them is a pulp installment, but a 70,000 word pulp installment, rather than like a 6,000 word one. What do you guys think? Does that make sense, or am I dead wrong on that, or?
I don't think you're wrong. When I read it, I just kind of figured that was how novels were like. I didn't have as strong a list for comparison.
I think the one where it's strongest, where that happens most clearly, is from which world to web of which world. Because Witch World ends and the holder are
Yeah,
in power, or the holder is a threat,
yeah,
and that's not resolved.
yeah.
And they don't resolve that.
They've won one battle against them,
They've won one
basically.
battle, they don't
Yeah.
resolve that till the next book.
Yeah,
So that one clearly ends as if there's a sequel coming.
that's true, yeah.
That one, it's really clear. I don't think in the other books it's quite that way.
Well, I mean, once you tell the story of one kid, you got to tell the story of the next kid, right?
Yeah,
So, I mean, once you get to the third and fourth, maybe.
Are you saying it ends abruptly as in unfinished, or that there's
It
a
just-
lack of continuity, or
No,
both?
no, neither. It just,
Cliffhanger?
it's
a
not
change,
it's not
but-
unfinished, but it feels unfinished
Okay.
somehow. You
That's
know?
like cliffhangers, almost.
And then those storylines aren't necessarily resolved in the sequel?
They are.
Oh, they are.
They're always not. They're not only resolved, but they manage to be woven into larger storylines, which is part of, I think, her greatness
But
as
there's
a
enough
writer.
room, but there's enough room at the end of every book for another story.
And more than
Well,
another
that's your
story.
ploy to keep selling more books.
Yeah, there's always room for another set
Yeah.
of
You wanna know,
stories.
you wanna figure
Yeah.
out how it ends, like a French film, you gotta keep, you just gotta keep.
Yeah.
But is it sort of like the old Batman series where it's like you know the Batman's gonna get out of it? Even though, you know what I mean? Like,
No, you don't.
we meet our hero. And,
No, I
No,
don't.
you don't.
Yeah,
Okay.
and they do get into sort of like Batman-like conundrums where how could they possibly,
Yeah.
get free
take
from this? Yeah, and they do.
Yeah. Okay. That's funny.
And the answers are not implausible. It's not sort of Deus ex machina. Something comes down and just solves the problem for them.
Gave Sci-Fi Channel writers their template, right?
Oh yeah,
The Strain,
yeah.
the Z Nation.
So one of the other themes I wanted to talk about, and I think it comes up with Simon and Jalith, but even more so with their kids, is this notion about figuring out who you are. And I mentioned that, you could see each of the three novels, number 3, 4, and 5 as being a coming of age story in a sense, but they're bigger than that. Each of these people already has a role, and they're figuring out where they fit into the land that they left and may come back to. And I came across an interesting quote. Somebody had written that in these Witch World series, for Norton, personal fulfillment required accepting the individual's contradictions, whether they were sexual, racial, or otherwise. And then they used as an example that the females think falsely they have to remain virginal to retain their power. But I thought that was a nice way to talk about it. As human beings, we always have contradictions. We're not perfectly rational. Our lives are kind of a mess. They're always kind of cobbling things. And I think about from adolescence on, we're always like redefining ourselves. One way to try to deal with that is just get rid of the contradictions. And you do that by saying, okay, this contradicts this. I have to make a decision between these two, and I'll never talk about this again. And that's what the witches are doing in this, and that's what the Falconers have done in their society. That's, I think, what Karsten is doing when they're trying to invade. And that's not what Norton portrays her characters as doing. Instead, they integrate these contradictory parts of themselves, and sometimes they do so, like you were pointing out, in terms of their relationship. So it's not just I integrate the contradictory parts of myself, but if I'm involved with you, I also try to integrate what's tapped into you, our relationship, and I try to integrate that with what's going on with me, and not make the contradictions go away, but you sort of take the sting out of them that way.
But isn't there a danger in that process that you're homogenizing diversity that you need? I mean,
Well,
diversity has a
right.
function. We call them contradictions or
Yeah,
whatever, but are they really just
So integrating,
elements of diversity
yeah,
that we can't deal with right away,
yeah.
so we call them a contradiction? And
So integrating isn't doing that.
well,
That would be different.
integrating
Yeah.
to an extent, but if you there's a risk of over-integrating, I guess, that you're
Yeah.
homogenizing.
Exactly,
And now
yeah,
you
yeah.
just destroyed the diversity that has a value
Well,
unto itself.
And that's what like the witches, are doing in this. They make that decision. Well, everything's got to be the way that we've had it for generations. That's one way to do it, right? Yeah, there's a definite danger, and I think too, when you're talking about young people, they don't really know what the hell they are. I mean, think about when we were young. I know things have turned out very, very different than I ever envisaged what they might be like. And so I think this is a theme that she deals with over and over again, not just in these books, but also in a number of her other books. How does the character figure out where they fit in, and the what you're calling diversity, I think, is a good way to talk about it. How do we bring these together? Because if you're too diverse, right, you can't function. You have to have some sort of center, some sort of identity. Otherwise, you're just sort of floating, or the parts within you kind of fight against each other.
Can you create different diverse worlds or groupings
Yeah.
that are not threatening to you, therefore the diversity can exist outside of you and it's not threatening?
Yeah.
But there have to be some commonality for interaction too.
No, I mean, you have to have a community.
Yeah.
And a community is based on some commonality of values. But it doesn't mean you have to destroy other, values that exist elsewhere outside of you unless you feel threatened by them.
Yeah.
Right. If you're very confident in your own core identity,
Yeah.
you can interact with cultures that challenge you without feeling threatened. You can interact with cultures that are different than yours without feeling like you're going to be somehow assimilated into it or threatened out of being who you are.
Yeah, and so we have a few characters in these stories who do exactly that. Like the Simon guy, right? He's not going to fit in with the Alazan people, but pretty much everybody else in the story, or the colder people, but pretty much everybody he can kind of relate to. He can talk their language and get along with them in one way or another. But most of the other people in the story, they're not like that. They do have that mentality of, well, you're from there, so got to kill you, or.
Well, doesn't that reflect a lot of human nature we see anyway? It's like we need to homogenize it to keep it simple, so that it's what you'd expect. And if you're different, you either have to assimilate, speak our language, become like us, or else you're out. And there's a human tendency, I think, to simplify things. Yeah. Because it's easier to manage if people are similar than if they're different.
Yeah, and this goes.
You see that with the witches here, because the witches, then their power, that's the way it's always been. So any girl who shows power must be trained to be like us.
Yeah.
And that's just how it is. It's a simple, if you have power, you're trained this way.
Yeah, I'd say that's.
That's
right.
If you think the power is going to be different, that complicates things.
Well, then it's a question of safety too. I mean, outside of homogenization, you're not safe sometimes. I mean, with some people, if they're not completely.
You certainly perceive it that way. Yeah, a lot of people perceive it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the problem is that very often, we can take a lot more diversity, right, than we originally think that we can, and so we might shut it down precisely because of simplicity or reliability, or sometimes if we got to get things done right away too, we want things to be the same across. We talk about standard operating procedure, right?
Mm-hmm. See, and that goes back to what we were talking about maybe at the beginning, the truth. People use this idea of truth, that I have the absolute truth and you are the other.
You have to agree with me.
Yeah, because I got the truth.
Because I got the truth, yeah.
I got the better truth. I got the original truth. I got the longer standing truth, whatever.
Ours is best. Yeah,
the best, then it all comes down to I have the better truth, therefore you come and be like me.
You gotta come and be like us.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, so the colder, these people who are like, very technologically advanced, but kind of soulless, and then turning everybody else into their slaves, controlled mentally, they are the epitome of that in this world. They're trying to take over everybody and sort of make them all be one big, you can't say happy family, but one big, everybody's on the same page kind of community. And so they're portrayed as being the most along those lines. But then the witches are like that too, and in a certain way, even those hawk guys are like that as well. They all have each of the cultures has a tendency to what you're calling homogenizing, in these stories. And the question is like, who's gonna be the top homogenizer in a way, I mean, the one group that
For the present tense.
the one group,
Lifetime goes on and all
Yeah.
these things change, so.
there is one group who I would say is more respectful of diversity, and that's the ones that are modeled after the Vikings, the salt carp. Yeah. They are rovers, they take their whole families on their ships and sail around and sometimes raid people, sometimes engage in trade, and the way they're portrayed, everybody gets to sort of decide for themselves how they're going to be. There are local leaders, but those are people they're not leaders because of blood or having magic. They can get people to recognize them as leaders.
You just got to get out of your little world enough to move around and see what else is out there to get a little more secure. Maybe that's why they're that way, because they are rovers and they usually more
that's a
than
very good
than
point.
just being
Yeah.
isolated.
Yeah.
And like you said, Andy, too, that the more confident you are in yourself and your own belief system, the less threatened you are by people outside.
Yeah,
So-
then you can be curious about what they think
Right.
rather than
Yeah.
afraid
Well,
of
I know
what they
the
think.
Viking model is curiosity driven.
Well, no, I'm just saying that they
No, but-
had more
well,
exposure to things.
You see that with people who travel a lot
Right.
more.
Yeah,
People who travel the
Right,
world
you got more exposure.
You have more exposure to different cultures, more exposure to different ways of looking at things than people who've always stayed in the same hometown for their whole life.
Yeah, I mean,
In general.
there's two ways to do that. I remember, when I was in the Army, we had a T-shirt that said, join the Army, travel the world, meet strange and interesting people, and kill them.
Oh.
So you could just say, diversity. I'm going to rack up a new set of trophies or something. But you're right. In general, travel widens our horizons.
I think a major piece of the witch world ties in with a bunch of other world builders.
Okay.
Is the gates.
Oh,
The
yeah,
concept
yeah.
of parallel universes.
Yeah.
And we had it with Moorcock.
Yeah.
You see it with one after another. I just came across a new series that has it, the Bright Empire series by Lawhead,
Okay.
which has the same concept of you've got multiple worlds
CJ
sitting
series
right
or
next to
games
each
on
other.
there.
Yeah.
Lackey has it in her Avalon series.
You know who else has it in Chronicles of Narnia? Is Lewis.
Yeah.
Yes,
And
Lewis
in
has
the
it.
6th book, you've got that place in between the worlds, like a forest with pools and stuff, and
Well, Le Guin has it with Lathe
Lathe of Heaven. You're
No,
thinking?
no, the one they just made a movie out of.
No, that's
The Wrinkle in
Lingle.
Time.
Wrinkle in
That's
Time.
Lingle.
Oh, that's
That's
Lingle. That's
Lingle.
Lingle.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Both
Wrinkle in
completed.
Time.
That's funny.
Yeah, Wrinkle in
Oh,
Time.
And
yeah.
that card had that too, in the
Yes.
later series in the end.
Orson's got card.
Gates Between Worlds.
The Tesseract counts, and I think a card counts with sort of his extra dimensional, you pop out of the universe and then pop back in.
Okay.
You start
Yeah.
doing that later in Speaker for the Dead and see.
Yeah. It's a little different with card, but yeah.
I mean, there's, I guess, two ways in which it gets done, right? You've got like I'm going to jump through gates myself. You've got like the single traveler, or maybe a band of people, and everybody else more or less stays in the same place in the universe. Or you've got like whole migrations of people, which is what's happening in Witch
That's
World,
what's happening,
right?
because everybody is migrating from someplace else,
Yeah.
pretty much.
But when you have whole peoples, now you got to figure out, well, who's going to live where, and who's going to colonize who, or are they going to get along? If it's just like travelers, almost like tourists, right? Touristing different worlds, then they're not that big of a deal. Maybe they'll bring a disease or.
Well, you've got the individual Simon Trigard.
Yeah.
And then you've got Alazan.
Yeah.
Alazan came through a gate.
Well, they all came through gates. At
They
the
all
time.
came through gates
Yeah.
as refugees or
Yeah.
whatever.
How do you access through gates, and what is that in there? I mean,
Well, so Simon at the very beginning.
portals of.
Yeah,
It's like portals,
it's
yeah.
actually the Siege Perilous of
In
Arthurian legend. It turns out it's an actual seat that you sit on, and at the right time of the day, boom, it transports you.
And some of the gates are actually gates.
Some are much bigger too.
They're
Yeah.
actual, like, gates.
Yeah.
But do you happen upon them? Or do you seek them out, or are you
Well,
told
most
where they
people
are, or-
just happen upon them.
Yeah, most people
Right.
just, yeah. Although in Witch World, they know where some of the gates are.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Colder use their gate, and they like put some people on one side to guard it, and they actually end up leaving them there, which really ticks them off. And then they're constantly putting men and material through, so it's a very organized way of using the gate. Yeah.
Others, they find a gate and they're trying to escape whatever's
Yeah.
going on in their world. So they use the gate as an escape.
But
Yeah.
people don't just kind of open a wardrobe and end up in Narnia. Like they know what's happening.
Well,
I'm not about this book, but there's a lot of this sort of thing out there in
Yeah.
television and movies a lot too. And sometimes they'll just be in, like I say, in pursuit. All of a sudden, kaboom!
Right.
Yikes! I'm in another world.
Yeah.
Right.
And there's a lot of this tesseracting thing stuff going on. That's a big thing. And opening portals and opening for other worlds. There's a lot of that in like a lot of the Marvel.
Some of it in the horror stuff too, like you open up the gate to the wrong place and you let the wrong thing in.
Look at the obsession with Stranger Things.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. True, yeah.
That's fun.
In Doctor Who, they had it too.
Yeah.
What, Doctor Who is fun.
Doctor Who
Tower
has
series.
lots of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose in a way it's
But they're a known thing. It's not a it's not
in this story,
Yeah.
in this framework, yeah. I
But
mean,
they don't
kind
know,
of.
But they don't know where all the gates are. They know there's gates, but they don't know where they all are.
But
Yeah.
they're born knowing, or they're told at a young age that these gates exist.
No, it depends on the culture.
No, it depends on the
okay.
culture.
I mean,
That's
this
what-
is a world of many cultures. Some are very low level, barbaric.
So they'd be the ones to kind of like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure themselves into something, right? Like suddenly they're there.
Well, they don't
Kind
end.
of bumbling.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. Or they came through at one time, like generations ago, and then they forgot that they ever came through there.
Yeah.
Or communities create their gates. Stonehenge and other stone monuments that transport.
Well, that's what the Colder do in the second book.
Yeah.
Is they create a gate so they can get back to their original world.
Yeah.
And different world builders do it differently. You can have gates where there's a system to get you where you want to go. But if you take the wrong step, if you
Yeah,
go
you
too
wind up in the wrong
fast
place.
or you go too slow, you end up in a different place. It's formulaic. Other places, it's just in this one, Simon Tregarth is told in the very first book to sit on the Siege Perilous, and it will take him to a world that suits him.
That's right. Yeah, I forgot about
That
that.
he will go.
So it can go to multiple places.
He could go to multiple places. It acknowledges that there are multiple places.
Yeah.
But it says he's told it will take him to a world that suits him.
So it puts him in a world where a warrior, would have a place. Yeah. Well, we should probably wrap up. Very stimulating discussion. Next time we're doing Arthur Clarke.